File 27 of a Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by George Yeager, Book 1, Part 3, Section 12, of the Probability of Causes. What I have said concerning the probability of chances can serve to no other purpose than to assist us in explaining the probability of causes, since it is commonly allowed by philosophers that what the vulgar call chance is nothing but a secret and concealed cause. That species of probability, therefore, is what we must chiefly examine. The probabilities of causes are of several kinds, but are all derived from the same origin, that is, the association of ideas to a present impression. As the habit which produces the association arises from the frequent conjunction of objects, it must arrive at its perfection by degrees, and must acquire new force from each instance that falls under our observation. The first instance has little or no force. The second makes some addition to it. The third becomes still more sensible, and it is by these slow steps that our judgment arrives at a full assurance. But before it attains this pitch of perfection, it passes through several inferior degrees, and in all of them is only to be esteemed a presumption or probability. The gradation, therefore, from probabilities to proofs is in many cases insensible, and the difference betwixt these kinds of evidence is more easily perceived in the remote degrees than in the near and contiguous. It is worthy of remark on this occasion that though the species of probability here explained be the first in order and naturally takes place before any entire proof can exist, yet no one who is arrived at the age of maturity can any longer be acquainted with it. It is true, nothing is more common than for people of the most advanced knowledge to have attained only an imperfect experience of many particular events, which naturally produces only an imperfect habit and transition. But then we must consider that the mind, having formed another observation concerning the connection of causes and effects, gives new force to its reasoning from that observation, and by means of it can build an argument on one single experiment when duly prepared and examined. What we have found once to follow from any object, we conclude will forever follow from it. And if this maxim be not always built upon as certain, it is not for want of a sufficient number of experiments, but because we frequently meet with instances to the contrary, which leads us to the second species of probability, where there is a contrariety in our experience and observation. It would be very happy for men in the conduct of their lives and actions were the same objects always conjoined together, and we had nothing to fear but the mistakes of our own judgment, without having any reason to apprehend the uncertainty of nature. But as it is frequently found that one observation is contrary to another, and that causes and effects follow not in the same order of which we have had experience, we are obliged to vary our reasoning on account of this uncertainty and take into consideration the contrariety of events. The first question that occurs on this head is concerning the nature and causes of the contrariety. The vulgar, who take things according to their first appearance, attribute the uncertainty of events to such an uncertainty in the causes as makes them often fail of their usual influence, though they meet with no obstacle nor impediment in their operation. But philosophers, observing that almost in every part of nature there is contained a vast variety of springs and principles which are hid by reason of their minuteness or remoteness, find that it is at least possible the contrariety of events may not proceed from any contingency in the cause, but from the secret operation of contrary causes. This possibility is converted into certainty by further observation when they remark that upon an exact scrutiny, a contrariety of effects always betrays a contrariety of causes and proceeds from their mutual hindrance and opposition. A peasant can give no better reason for the stopping of any clock or watch than to say that commonly it does not go right. But an artisan easily perceives that the same force in the spring or pendulum has always the same influence on the wheels, but fails of its usual effect, perhaps by reason of a grain of dust, which puts a stop to the whole movement. From the observation of several parallel instances, philosophers form a maxim that the connection betwixt all causes and effects is equally necessary, and that its seeming uncertainty in some instances proceeds from the secret opposition of contrary causes. But however philosophers and the vulgar may differ in their explication of the contrariety of events, their inferences from it are always of the same kind, and founded on the same principles. A contrariety of events in the past may give us a kind of hesitating belief for the future after two several ways. First, by producing an imperfect habit and transition from the present impression to the related idea. When the conjunction of any two objects is frequent, without being entirely constant, the mind is determined to pass from one object to the other, but not with so entire a habit as when the union is uninterrupted, and all the instances we have ever met with are uniform and of a piece. We find from common experience in our actions as well as reasonings that a constant perseverance in any course of life produces a strong inclination and tendency to continue for the future. Though there are habits of inferior degrees of force proportioned to the inferior degrees of steadiness and uniformity in our conduct.
I have to admit, I am not on board with what he's talking about. It seems very wordy and convoluted, as I pointed out at other times. I'm kind of lost in the words, and I'm not sure where we're going. So it would take me too long to try and deconstruct things, as I also pointed out before. At various points where it gets convoluted, I'll just have to see, does it ring any bell, or do I just have to keep carrying on? So in this case, I'm carrying on.
There is no doubt but this principle sometimes takes place and produces those inferences we draw from contrary phenomena, though I am persuaded that upon examination we shall not find it to be the principle that most commonly influences the mind in this species of reasoning. When we follow only the habitual determination of the mind, we make the transition without any reflection, and interpose not a moment's delay betwixt the view of one object and the belief of that which is often found to attend it. As the custom depends not upon any deliberation, it operates immediately, without allowing any time for reflection. But this method of proceeding we have but few instances of in our probable reasonings, and even fewer than in those which are derived from the uninterrupted conjunction of objects. In the former species of reasoning, we commonly take knowingly into consideration the contrariety of past events. We compare the different sides of the contrariety and carefully weigh the experiments which we have on each side, whence we may conclude that our reasonings of this kind arise not directly from the habit, but in an oblique manner, which we must now endeavor to explain. It is evident that when an object is attended with contrary effects, we judge of them only by our past experience, and always consider those as possible which we have observed to follow from it. And as past experience regulates our judgment concerning the possibility of these effects, so it does that concerning their probability, and that effect which has been the most common we always esteem the most likely. Here then are two things to be considered, that is, the reasons which determine us to make the past a standard for the future, and the manner how we extract a single judgment from a contrariety of past events. First, we may observe that the supposition that the future resembles the past is not founded on arguments of any kind, but is derived entirely from habit, by which we are determined to expect for the future the same train of objects to which we have been accustomed. This habit or determination to transfer the past to the future is full and perfect, and consequently, the first impulse of the imagination in this species of reasoning is endowed with the same qualities. But secondly, when in considering past experiments we find them of a contrary nature, this determination, though full and perfect in itself, presents us with no steady object, but offers us a number of disagreeing images in a certain order and proportion. The first impulse, therefore, is here broke into pieces, and diffuses itself over all those images of which each partakes an equal share of that force and vivacity that is derived from the impulse. Any of these past events may again happen, and we judge that when they do happen, they will be mixed in the same proportion as in the past. If our intention, therefore, be to consider the proportions of contrary events in a great number of instances, the images presented by our past experience must remain in their first form and preserve their first proportions. Suppose, for instance, I have found by long observation that of 20 ships which go to sea, only 19 return. Suppose I see at present 20 ships that leave the port. I transfer my past experience to the future and represent to myself 19 of these ships as returning in safety and one as perishing. Concerning this, there can be no difficulty. But as we frequently run over those several ideas of past events in order to form a judgment concerning one single event which appears uncertain, this consideration must change the first form of our ideas and draw together the divided images presented by experience, since it is
I do have a sense that because of his ontology and maybe the limitations of how to use it for further clarification, he risks and seemingly end up in situations where he has to make these extremely convoluted explanations. It seems he goes into sort of a, what would that be called? What do you call that when there was this bridge in the USA because of the wind. It started to swing, and and it broke down at some point. Right, there were cars on it that flew off the bridge. It's because of the particular speed of the wind, and at some point things start to rock because of, and it has a particular term, but this is the sort of a metaphor for when people start to go into a mode where they sort of get in a repetitive kind of state. And I have that notion with him at this point here, right? I can't see the extreme importance of where he's trying to go. It might be because I just can't see it. But concerning other aspects that I would find of more importance, I don't see the balancing of the energy used to explain these particular aspects compared to other aspects that I would find much more important, to spend your time on philosophically. That might be because of things have changed through years. Again, this is early enlightenment, and I keep that in mind also. That if I deconstruct somebody is a contemporary thinker, philosopher, it's different from when you are sort of deconstructing something that is almost 300 years old, right? And written by somebody who couldn't possibly have the amount of for whom these other kinds of thinking and understandings and all sorts of science and mathematics and so on, right, that has sort of clarified and maybe to some extent make it more confusing, but philosophy in the last 300 years, if anything, have by at the end of the day clarified various aspects of where importance is and less importance is, in my opinion, right? So where these are cornerstones of philosophy. I sense that he has a kind of a beef with something that he's going for, that this is to turn out to, and then the conclusion will come, and therefore something, right? It seems overly complicated compared to what I can see of any useful product of all these fabulations, right? Okay.
To it we refer the determination of that particular event upon which we reason. Many of these images are supposed to concur, and a superior number to concur on one side. These agreeing images unite together and render...
Maybe it's because that this is sort of a just a thought, right? As he's considered one of the founding fathers, quote, of cognitive science and cognitive philosophy and philosophy of cognition, whatever you want to call it, that these aspects are groundbreaking new avenues into arguing philosophy. And therefore it's uncharted territory, right? And there is no necessary balance for him. Maybe he sees all sorts of problems with people reading it who are completely unused to various kinds of thinking. And therefore, with our eyes, or my eyes at least, right, at this point in time, almost 300 years later, some of this seems overblown and underdeveloped and so on, right? But with a 1729 eyes, this might seem, wow, he is very good at this new thing, that sort of new approach. So he elaborates much more on it to help the reader get there, which would not necessarily, wouldn't be necessary to the same degree at this point in time, where all sorts of aspects of this kind, neuroscience and understanding of terms used and so on, ways of thinking and reasoning, that is more clear now, right? More established, you could say. So maybe that could be an excuse for Hume, right?
Render the idea more strong and lively, not only than a mere fiction of the imagination, but also than any idea which is supported by a lesser number of experiments. Each new experiment is as a new stroke of the pencil, which bestows an additional vivacity on the colors without either multiplying or enlarging the figure. This operation of the mind has been so fully explained in treating of the probability of chance that I need not here endeavor to render it more intelligible. Every past experiment may be considered as a kind of chance, it being uncertain to us whether the object will exist conformable to one experiment or another. And for this reason, everything that has been said on the one subject is applicable to both. Thus, upon the whole, contrary experiments produce an imperfect belief, either by weakening the habit or by dividing and afterwards joining in different parts that perfect habit which makes us conclude in general that instances of which we have no experience must necessarily resemble those of which we have. To justify still further this.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that there is a tendency to be limited to what you can have an idea of. What you, I don't know, because if you have an impression, there should be an idea, right? And if you have a new impression and a new sort of simple idea, I would think that all simple ideas, basically all simple ideas are established very early on in childhood. The idea of leg, the idea of arm, the idea of tree and branches and spheres and squares and whatever it could be, it's all established. You might not be good at using it in a free will situation as such, but I think it's quickly established. So children love fairy tale stories and little girls like unicorns and so on, right? It sort of piques their, maybe also this horse thing, maybe, right? But and the fantastic horses, but it's they like fairy tale stories, dragons and monsters, and because it's sort of bordering on what can be experienced, possibly developing the cognitive skills, right? And grappling with the ideas and so on. I might have been interested in these kinds of things when I was 8, 9, 10 years old or so, but I'm not now. I don't read fairy tales, right? I mean, there maybe the Emperor's New Clothes now and then, right? But I feel very much like the little boy saying the Emperor has no clothes, right? But that if you haven't experienced a particular instance that might be the result of some kind of causal structure, then you might find something else that you think should be there because that's what you can identify. So it's this discrepancy I think he's sort of trying to deal with. I'm not sure, but I'm just thinking, out loud here, right?
This account of the second species of probability, where we reason with knowledge and reflection from a contrariety of past experiments, I shall propose the following considerations without fearing to give offense by that air of subtlety which attends them. Just reasoning ought still, perhaps, to retain its force, however subtle, in the same manner as matter preserves its solidity in the air, and fire, and animal spirits, as well as in the grosser and more sensible forms. First, we may observe that there is no probability so great as not to allow of a contrary possibility, because otherwise it would cease to be a probability
of course.
and would become a certainty. That probability of causes which is most extensive and which we at present examine.
I think he is on fluffy ground here, right? He tries to make much sense of causes and ideas and probabilities and chances and certainty and uncertainty and contradiction, and it is very convoluted, this, right? I don't really want to inflict my mind on this or let it inflict itself on my mind. But I understand, if the probability of something is 1 or 100% or whatever it is, then it's certain. But how can it possibly be? Because that would be a perfect prediction of the future, which is ridiculous in my opinion. I have to rearrange myself here. That is ridiculous in my opinion, right? Certainty is a perfect prediction of the future. A prediction that cannot be, that you don't even have to go and look, right? It's the case. No, I don't have to look, right? And if you have to look, it must be because you're not certain, right? And it's a problem of, and I think that Hume is along with me on this, at least to some extent. There's a very sharp delineation between the past, the now, and the future. They are three different categories. And when you try to bridge, you are mixing categories you are not allowed to mix, right? You can try to predict the future, right? But that prediction is no longer a prediction when you get to that predicted point in time, because then it's the now. So it's this sort of, the now is moving along, it's metaphorically along a timeline, and adding a lot of past or more and more past to it, and trying to predict the near future, right? And you have to keep them separated. At least there are various aspects in philosophy where that particular philosophy is only possible in one of them. And I might even jump the boat and say any philosophy is only possible in one of them, right? It might actually be the case. I haven't actually thought of this before. But if you're talking about knowledge, for instance, right? You cannot have knowledge of the future, because then you would be violating any reasonable standard for having knowledge, which would be empiricism. And even those who disregard empiricism as a limitation of what can be knowledge, they seem to be adhering to an idea of empiricism as knowledge, right? And then they might be screwing around with the definition of knowledge so they can get around it or whatever, right? Knowledge is that which is most beneficial for you to focus on in an agreement, but that is valuable to you to focus on, and that you at the same time can be in complete agreement with somebody else on. That would be knowledge, in my opinion, right? Knowledge is the only thing that can go and become objective. So, and that can only be in the now, because it's only in the now that you have empirical access. You don't have empirical access to the past. Never mind how much that I saw a cat scuttling out between a hedge just before. I don't have empirical sense or empirical access to that experience anymore. It's a memory. It's no longer knowledge, because now it's a memory. It's not empiricism, right? Even though it might consider it based on empiricism, obviously. And Hume would say the same when it comes to impressions and so on, right? But now it's just an idea, as Hume would say. So an idea cannot be knowledge, right? In my opinion, he's wrong when he says knowledge is a comparison of ideas. I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't qualify knowledge as that. And I think that in recent years, knowledge has become a much more developed kind of philosophy than it seemingly was at Hume's time, right? That knowledge was something more like a library or an encyclopedia or something like that. And maybe if that's his understanding, so be it, right? I'm more in the sort of Platonic tradition of trying to philosophize about what is knowledge, right? Maybe not the conclusions, but that the approach in understanding what would knowledge be, right? It's closer at least, right? So it's, and I see him sort of walking around the ideas of the past, the present, and the future. And sometimes he seems to respect the differences, and sometimes he sort of combines it without being careful, right? So maybe I'm just, misunderstanding. That might be the case, right? I can rule that out. But I think in my opinion, it is extremely important to keep these three things separate: the past, the present, and the future, right? And how you define which is a good exercise to do, right? And a lot of shit can be removed when you define these three groupings or realms, lacking a better term, right? And you pinpoint where you can have what. Then you have come a long way in philosophy, in my opinion.
Depends on a contrariety of experiments, and it is evident an experiment in the past proves at least a possibility for the future. Secondly, the component parts of this possibility and probability are of the same nature and differ in number only, but not in kind. It has been observed that all single chances are entirely equal, and that the only circumstance which can give any event that is contingent a superiority over another is a superior number of chances. In like manner as the uncertainty of causes is discovered by experience, which presents us with a view of contrary events, it is plain that when we transfer the past to the future, the known to the unknown, every past experiment has the same weight, and that it is only a superior number of them which can throw the balance on any side. The possibility, therefore, which enters into every reasoning of this kind is composed of parts which are of the same nature both among themselves and with those that compose the opposite probability. Thirdly, we may establish it as a certain maxim that in all moral as well as natural phenomena, wherever any cause consists of a number of parts, and the effect increases or diminishes according to the variation of that number, the effect, properly speaking, is a compounded one, and arises from the union of the several effects that proceed from each part of the cause. Thus, because the gravity of a body increases or diminishes by the increase or diminution of its parts, we conclude that each part contains this quality and contributes to the gravity of the whole. The absence or presence of a part of the cause is attended with that of a proportionable part of the effect. This connection or constant conjunction sufficiently proves the one part to be the cause of the other. As the belief which we have of any event increases or diminishes according to the number of chances or past experiments, it is to be considered as a compounded effect, of which each part arises from a proportionable number of chances or experiments. Let us now join these three observations and see what conclusion we can draw from them. To every probability, there is an opposite possibility. This possibility is composed of parts that are entirely of the same nature with those of the probability and consequently have the same influence on the mind and understanding. The belief which attends the probability is a compounded effect and is formed by the concurrence of the several effects which proceed from each part of the probability. Since, therefore, each part of the probability contributes to the production of the belief, each part of the possibility must have the same influence on the opposite side, the nature of these parts being entirely the same. The contrary belief, attending the possibility, implies a view of a certain object as well as the probability does an opposite view. In this particular, both these degrees of belief are alike. The only manner, then, in which the superior number of similar component parts in the one can exert its influence and prevail above the inferior in the other is by producing a stronger and more lively view of its object. Each part presents a particular view, and all these views uniting together produce one general view, which is fuller and more distinct by the greater number of causes or principles from which it is derived. The component parts of the probability and possibility, being alike in their nature, must produce like effects, and the likeness of their effects consists in this, that each of them presents a view of a particular object. But though these parts be alike in their nature, they are very different in their quantity and number, and this difference must appear in the effect as well as the similarity. Now, as the view they present is in both cases full and entire, and comprehends the object in all its parts, it is impossible that in this particular there can be any difference, nor is there anything but a superior vivacity in the probability arising from the concurrence of a superior number of views which can distinguish these effects. Here is almost the same argument in a different light. All our reasonings concerning the probability of causes are founded on the transferring of past to future. The transferring of any past experiment to the future is sufficient to give us a view of the object, whether that experiment be single or combined with others of the same kind, whether it be entire or opposed by others of a contrary kind. Suppose, then, it acquires both these qualities of combination and opposition. It loses not upon that account its former power of presenting a view of the object, but only concurs with and opposes other experiments that have a like influence. A question, therefore, may arise concerning the manner both of the concurrence and opposition. As to the concurrence, there is only the choice left betwixt these two hypotheses. First, that the view of the object occasioned by the transference of each past experiment preserves itself entire and only multiplies the number of views. Or, secondly, that it runs into the other similar and correspondent views and gives them a superior degree of force and vivacity. But that the first hypothesis is erroneous is evident from experience, which informs us that the belief attending any reasoning consists in one conclusion, not in a multitude of similar ones, which would only distract the mind, and in many cases would be too numerous to be comprehended distinctly by any finite capacity. It remains, therefore, as the only reasonable opinion that these similar views run into each other and unite their forces so as to produce a stronger and clearer view than what arises from any one alone. This is the manner in which past experiments concur when they are transferred to any future event. As to the manner of their opposition, it is evident that as the contrary views are incompatible with each other, and it is impossible the object can at once exist conformable to both of them, their influence becomes mutually destructive, and the mind is determined to the superior only with that force which remains after subtracting the inferior. I am sensible how abstruse all this reasoning must appear to the generality of readers who, not being accustomed to such profound reflections on the intellectual faculties of the mind,
At least he is honest about it. I like that, right? It is. If you don't know, you're sitting alone on an island for 100 days and don't know what to do, you could try and decipher what Hume is trying to say here, right? And good luck.
mind will be apt to reject as chimerical whatever strikes not in with the common received notions and with the easiest and most obvious principles of philosophy. And no doubt there are some pains required to enter into these arguments, though perhaps very little are necessary to perceive the imperfection of every vulgar hypothesis on this subject, and the little light which philosophy can yet afford us in such sublime and such curious speculations. Let men be once fully persuaded of these two principles: that there is nothing in any object considered in itself which can afford us a reason for drawing a conclusion beyond it, and that even after the observation of the frequent or constant conjunction of objects, we have no reason to draw any inference concerning any object beyond those of which we have had experience. I say, let men be once fully convinced of these two principles, and this will throw them so loose from all common systems that they will make no difficulty of receiving any which may appear the most extraordinary. These principles we have found to be sufficiently convincing, even with regard to our most certain reasonings from causation. But I shall venture to affirm that with regard to these conjectural or probable reasonings, they still acquire a new degree of evidence. First, it is obvious that in reasonings of this kind, it is not the object presented to us which, considered in itself, affords us any reason to draw a conclusion concerning any other object or event. For as this latter object is supposed uncertain, and as the uncertainty is derived from a concealed contrariety of causes in the former, were any of the causes placed in the known qualities of that object, they would no longer be concealed, nor would our conclusion be uncertain.
I'll make a little note here. I want to highlight this one, though it is highlighted already, and maybe take another stab at this one. And it's sort of it basically invalidates what he's been doing in the last many parts. Attempt. It's like a sort of devil's advocate, or what would that be called? He's arguing as if he's trying to prove something, and then he says, well, then I can prove something. It's sort of a weird I'm not even sure what it would be called. There's something, there are various kinds of proofs in mathematics and geometry and so on. And by trying to prove something that you can't prove it, you thereby disprove it. Something like that, right? Okay, enough of that. Let me take the quote here. There is nothing in any object considered in itself which can afford us a reason for drawing a conclusion beyond it. And that even after the observation of the frequent or constant conjunction of objects, we have no reason to draw any inference concerning any object beyond those of which we have had experience. No, so there's nothing about an object that you can say, and therefore there's something about outside the object. And because there are various objects present, more than one object of various of the same or different kind, there's no necessarily any connection or anything any conjunction of we have no reason to draw any inferences concerning any object beyond those of which we have had experience. Constant conjunction, that there's some particular constant or repeating connection between objects. He's very, very concerned about this, and because it's a very important aspect of not going further than you can. Now, you could have, in my opinion, you need to. You can't just sit there and say, okay, I experience elephant. Okay, elephant, right? What do I do with it, right? There is some, I mean, it's too empty, it's too futile to just sit there and say, oh, elephant. We are inferring things by our own accord because there is some ends to our interaction with various objects. And we necessarily, we have developed, you could say, and evolution was not a part of thinking back then, right? But we have developed to do this thing for a reason, and the reason is that it works, right? I can't tell you why we are doing it. I can't give you a purpose, but it is there because it works, and it works towards an end, and the end is that I benefit from having this ability to infer various aspects and make these conjunctions or make these extensions from objects, right? When I see an object, I would like to predict how it would likely behave based on the qualities of this object, right? Based on its kind in a conceptual sense, but also maybe its qualities. Does it have a bad smell, or does it smell like a sickness, or whatever it is, right? He is skeptical about what you can claim for certain, and with good reason, I think, right? But that doesn't mean that you can decide for yourself, I would like to run away from that tiger, right? That tiger is not probably going to eat me, right? I'm running the other way, right? That is perfectly well. It's not because I know it, because I can't know it. But there are certain things, particular things I don't want to know. I don't want to know if it's eating me. And it would have to be eating me in order for me to know it. So I don't want to know it. And therefore I have to extend my experience into the future in order to make these kinds of decisions, right? And the problem with his philosophy could possibly be, and maybe it's not a problem of his philosophy, but how people interpret what he's saying. That you shouldn't draw any conclusions. You shouldn't have any cause and effect, right? That's not what he's saying. He's just making sure that you are not claiming more than you can claim. Or maybe I want to give him that kudo, right? But all the fabulation he has been doing is beyond this. He's trying to deal with cause and effect and necessary connections and so on, conjunctions of ideas and so on. So that is because he's dealing with that on an everyday basis. And it's natural. But it doesn't mean that I can tell you this is going to happen in the future, right? As if I know it. I could give you, my reason would be, don't jump from the Eiffel Tower. You are probably going to die, right? And that's perfect reasoning, but it's not knowledge. But just because it's not knowledge, it doesn't mean you can't reason about it, right? Because I would contend that every single fucking human being on this layer, batshit crazy, right, is doing this all the time. I'm constantly, my mind is basically, a few minutes ahead all the time. Seconds and minutes maybe, right? What's going to happen in the next second? I'm going to do this, going to that, basing on this, but prior, it goes on all the time. And it doesn't mean that we can point to it in an empirical manner. I can't point to, say, look at that tiger, look at it, see, it will attack me in 3 seconds. I can't do that. In 3 seconds, if it's chewing on my leg, right, I can say, that tiger is chewing on my leg. That would be correct. That is empirical. But there's no empiricism about the tiger that says it is eating my foot in 3 seconds. And that is what it's trying to point at, in my opinion. I might be wrong on this, but to the best of my understanding, this sort of to cut it very down and dirty, right? And I like that he sometimes does this condensing things into a short sentence and say something like this. I think this, right? And he's also quite honest about, okay, this I've just done this for 20 pages or whatever. That might be a little hard on your mind, and I feel with you that it might be my musings here might be a little convoluted, and it may hurt your brain, right? So it's kind of interesting that he has this direct connection with the reader, right? He is very, he is kind of, though he has this academic, tendency, and sort of slightly, he likes to use words, right? But he is down, he puts himself down to earth, right? He tries to be connected with an everyday that is functional. It seems to me, right? I might be putting things into, but for all I have heard, right? He was very liked by people around him. He was sort of friendly and invited people to dinner, and right? He was kind of a, except for those Christians, right? He was a liked person. He couldn't get a professorship in the university because those who sat there and ruled the university apparently were Catholics, so they wouldn't have a guy like him in, right? And it just goes to show a very important aspect of philosophy, right? Those you usually hear about are those who were allowed into the powerful positions, right? And their philosophy was pushed, right? And those who weren't in favor, you didn't really hear too much about. It's only when we started on the in modern times, possibly, right, that you would hear much about. Otherwise, they would have to be kind of mystic or put them in third-person views, like Plato, right, who were writing as if he was creating dialogues with Plato and Socrates and somebody else. So he implanted his philosophy into a third person, right? And thereby he could say, yeah, but it was what Socrates, I didn't say it, it was Socrates who said it, right? So he wouldn't be, have to kill himself if somebody, found him offensive or something like that, right? So you can always say, no, 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 but I'm just saying what Socrates says, and he's already dead. He can't be killed again, right? So, okay.
But secondly, it is equally obvious in this species of reasoning that if the transference of the past to the future were founded merely on a conclusion of the understanding, it could never occasion any belief or assurance. When we transfer contrary experiments to the future, we can only repeat these contrary experiments with their particular proportions, which could not produce assurance in any single event upon which we reason, unless the fancy melted together all those images that concur, and extracted from them one single idea or image, which is intense and lively in proportion to the number of experiments from which it is derived, and their superiority above their antagonists. Our past experience presents no determinate object, and as our belief, however faint, fixes itself on a determinate object, it is evident that the belief arises not merely from the transference of past to future, but from some operation of the fancy conjoined with it. This may lead us to conceive the manner in which that faculty enters into all our reasonings.
If he is doing all these jumping through hoops of argumentation, right, to invalidate how Christians have beliefs, I think it's futile, right? Because it's basically just child abuse. That's all it is. And the cognitive dissonance is making you reject other stories, right? Like when you have to reject that which is philosophical rather than dogmatic in a religious manner, and trying to do this rigid and trying to convince. These are people who don't care about rigid philosophy, right? Those who he might attempt to reach won't read this book, right? All their masters will tell them, don't read that book or you will go to hell, right? So they won't read it, right? And those who are Protestant or non-believers, let's say non-believers, right? They're not the target group, right? So it's kind of futile attempt this, though I'm probably say he needs to do it because that's just who he is. Because it's so it's so present in him. I can relate to this, that okay, maybe it won't be favorable to me. I might run into all sorts of problem by stating this, but then I would bow down to pressure, and then my philosophy would be formed by my fear of this, that, and the other. I don't want that. If this is my philosophy, then this is my philosophy, right? Be damned, so be it, right? So I like this. I like this principled approach to things, right? That you're not forming yourself according to a power structure. You are only responding to your own will at making the best possible philosophy you can. So that's a very high integrity, right? And this smells of integrity to me, right? At least, if nothing else.
I shall conclude this subject with two reflections which may deserve our attention. The first may be explained after this manner. When the mind forms a reasoning concerning any matter of fact which is only probable, it casts its eye backward upon past experience, and transferring it to the future, is presented with so many contrary views of its object, of which those that are of the same kind, uniting together and running into one act of the mind, serve to fortify and enliven it. But suppose that this multitude of views or glimpses of an object proceeds not from experience, but from a voluntary act of the imagination. This effect does not follow, or at least follows not in the same degree. For though custom and education produce belief by such a repetition as is not derived from experience, yet this requires a long tract of time, along with a very frequent and undesigned repetition. In general, we may pronounce that a person who would voluntarily repeat any idea in his mind, though supported by one past experience, would be no more inclined to believe the existence of its object than if he had contented himself with one survey of it. Beside the effect of design, each act of the mind, being separate and independent, has a separate influence, and joins not its force with that of its fellows. Not being united by any common object producing them, they have no relation to each other, and consequently make no transition or union of forces. This phenomenon we shall understand better afterwards. My second reflection is founded on those large probabilities which the mind can judge of, and the minute differences it can observe betwixt them. When the chances or experiments on one side amount to 10,000, and on the other to 10,001, the judgment gives the preference to the latter upon account of that superiority, though it is plainly impossible for the mind to run over every particular view and distinguish the superior vivacity of the image arising from the superior number, where the difference is so inconsiderable. We have a parallel instance in the affections. It is evident, according to the principles above mentioned, that when an object produces any passion in us which varies according to the different quantity of the object, I say it is evident that the passion, properly speaking, is not a simple emotion, but a compounded one of a great number of weaker passions derived from a view of each part of the object. For otherwise, it were impossible the passion should increase by the increase of these parts. Thus, a man who desires 1,000 pounds has in reality 1,000 or more desires which, uniting together, seem to make only one passion, though the composition evidently betrays itself upon every alteration of the object by the preference he gives to the larger number, if superior only by an unit. Yet nothing can be more certain than that so small a difference would not be discernible in the passions, nor could render them distinguishable from each other. The difference, therefore, of our conduct in preferring the greater number depends not upon our passions, but upon custom and general rules. We have found in a multitude of instances that the augmenting the numbers of any sum augments the passion where the numbers are precise.
There is this point of diminishing return, which is sort of a concept or an idea in economics, that the first car you have is more important than car number 17, right? Car number 17 is just, another fancy car that is nice to have, right? But the first car you have is always, the second one is nice if the first one breaks down or, just for the sake of having different cars. But the third and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth car and so on is just, there's diminishing return of passion about it. Does it make any difference? Does it become 10% more passion if you have 11 cars rather than 10 cars? I don't think so, right? It also, things come with costs and benefits. And I don't think he's quite sharp enough on these aspects, because a passion, there are passions for and passions against, right? You say, okay, that I like this car, but it's expensive. But I like it. Yeah, but it's expensive, right? Yeah, but I like it. Yeah, but it's expensive. you know. Um, so yeah, let's keep going.
And the difference sensible. The mind can perceive from its immediate feeling that 3 guineas produce a greater passion than 2. And this it transfers to larger numbers because of the resemblance, and by a general rule assigns to 1,000 guineas a stronger passion than to 999. These general rules we shall explain presently. But beside these 2 species of probability, which are derived from an imperfect experience and from contrary causes, there is a third arising from analogy, which differs from them in some material circumstances. According to the hypothesis above explained, all kinds of reasoning from causes or effects are founded on 2 particulars, that is, the constant conjunction of any 2 objects in all past experience, and the resemblance of a present object to any one of them. The effect of these 2 particulars is that the present object invigorates and enlivens the imagination, and the resemblance, along with the constant union, conveys this force and vivacity to the related idea, which we are therefore said to believe or assent to. If you weaken either the union or resemblance, you weaken the principle of transition, and of consequence, that belief which arises from it. The vivacity of the first impression cannot be fully conveyed to the related idea, either where the conjunction of their objects is not constant, or where the present impression does not perfectly resemble any of those whose union we are accustomed to observe. In those probabilities of chance and causes above explained, it is the constancy of the union which is diminished, and in the probability derived from analogy, it is the resemblance only which is affected. Without some degree of resemblance as well as union, it is impossible there can be any reasoning, but as this resemblance admits of many different degrees, the reasoning becomes proportionably more or less firm and certain. An experiment loses of its force when transferred to instances which are not exactly resembling, though it is evident it may still retain as much as may be the foundation of probability, as long as there is any resemblance remaining. End of file 27.
Okay, this was a long and straining sit through. This is the end of section 12 of part 3. And let me see, the next part is called of unphilosophical probability. That might be interesting to get to also, though I'm having a bit of a hard time getting through this, but I'm taking one for the team, right? Please share, like, and subscribe. And I rounded 250 subscribers. Yay! After 7 or 8 years, 250 subscribers. I have been flagged as a bad apple, right? Because I have been critical of all sorts of... I've been critical of governments, critical of feminism, critical of basically all kinds of isms, right? So, of course, I've been labeled as a bad apple, and that's why you're not likely going to see my videos in a search on YouTube, and therefore I will not get too many subs. So if you would like, please help me by subbing yourself or recommending me to other people who might actually think positive of what I'm doing, right? Or at least they can think negative also if they want. I'm open for anything, basically, right? As long as you are you have good intentions in doing rigid philosophy. Otherwise, Have a nice day. See you in the next one.